The Green Party leader, Zack Palansky, is being smeared over his opposition to Israel's genocide by former Tory cabinet minister Michael Gove and by the Daily Mail columnist Sarah Vine. And this really is just gross, really vile. The only Jewish party leader in Britain, and one of only 5 Jewish party leaders in our history, has been compared to Adolf Hitler by one Daily Mail columnist. We'll come on to that. And the former Tory cabinet minister Michael Gove has accused him of exploiting prejudice against Jewish people in order to win an election. These are absolutely vile attacks, and they must and will be confronted. It comes after Zack Palansky shared an article from the right-wing pro-Israel newspaper, the Daily Mail, headlined, "Israel condemns hateful and racist Greens." Well, there is no better compliment than being smeared as hateful and racist by the Israeli state. Every accusation being a confession, this being a really striking example. The Israeli state, which is so hateful and racist, it has committed genocide against the Palestinian people, which is the most racist and hateful act it is possible to commit. Now, Zack Palansky shared the headline with the comment, "For years, we've seen an ongoing genocide. It's been backed by right-wing papers, the US president, and by this Labour government." Enter stage right, Michael Gove, who served as a cabinet minister throughout the 14 catastrophic years of Tory rule, which left this country ruined. He was in the cabinet which, for the first 9 months of Israel's genocide, armed and backed that genocide, and indeed cut funding to UNRWA, the UN Agency for Palestinian Refugees, and the main humanitarian agency in Gaza, a decision taken based on false, unevidenced claims by Israel about links to terrorism. So, waging war on the main humanitarian agency in Gaza at a time when there was a humanitarian catastrophe enveloping Gaza because of the Israeli state. Now, since the Tory defeat, Michael Gove has been editor of the hard-right Spectator magazine, because there's a revolving door in this country between politics and media, which apparently is seen as normal and fine and healthy. Michael Gove responded to Zack Palansky, "It's not a genocide. Rwanda was a genocide, the Shoah was a genocide, equating Israel with the Inter-Army or SS is just wicked." Zack Palansky then responded, "Amnesty International, Médecins Sans Frontières, Save the Children, the United Nations, the International Association of Genocide Scholars, B'Tselem," that's the Israeli NGO, Physicians for Human Rights in Israel, Palestinian Human Rights Organizations Council, Islamic Relief, all say it's a genocide. And then Michael Gove responded to that, "You can only make the accusation of genocide if you deprive the word of its meaning. We all know what you're doing. Appealing to prejudice to win an election. You are better than that." We will come on to the substance of Gove's claims about genocide, but what an absolute disgrace. Michael Gove is not Jewish. Zack Palansky is Jewish. Michael Gove is accusing the Green Party leader of exploiting prejudice against his own people for political gain. Because what? Zack Palansky opposes Israel's genocide. That is based, of course, on equating the crimes committed by Israel as a state with Jewish people as a people. What does Gove think he is doing here? What right does he think he has to smear a Jewish political leader with such a disgraceful attack? Now, Gove lists 2 genocides, the Shoah, that is the Nazis' extermination of 6 million Jews, and the Rwandan genocide when Hutu extremists murdered the Tutsi minority as well as Hutus deemed to be opponents. All genocides throughout history, as we'll discuss, as genocide scholars always emphasize, take different forms. For example, the Srebrenica massacre of 1995 is classified as a genocide. This is when Bosnian Serb forces murdered 8,000 Bosniak Muslim men and boys aged 12 and above. Like all genocides, Srebrenica has genocide deniers, not least in Israel. Israel's ambassador to Serbia, Yael Vilan, caused outrage after he told Russian state media 2 years ago that calling Srebrenica a genocide diminishes the importance of that term, which in my opinion should only be used for genocides. He added, Srebrenica should not be called genocide. Indeed, there's long been sympathies between Israeli leaders and Serb nationalists. They have lots of common underlying themes. Srebrenica looks very different, yes, to Rwanda or the Holocaust, but it's still a genocide. Another example is Myanmar's onslaught against the Rohingya people. In 2018, a UN independent international fact-finding mission concluded that senior Myanmar military leaders should be prosecuted by an international criminal tribunal for genocide, crimes against humanity, and war crimes. In 2020, the International Court of Justice ordered provisional measures in the Rohingya case, finding that rights claimed under the Genocide Convention were plausible, a very similar kind of provisional measures ruling to the ICJ's Gaza orders in 2024. As over Gaza, it hasn't ruled on the merits yet because that process takes a long time. The ICJ is currently, at the moment, holding hearings on the Rohingya genocide. But in 2022, the US government made a formal determination that Myanmar's military had committed genocide. Now, in this genocide, thousands of Rohingya were killed, many of their villages destroyed, hundreds of thousands fled to neighbouring Bangladesh. Again, this genocide looks very different to Srebrenica or to Rwanda or to the Holocaust. Now, both in absolute numbers and proportionally, Myanmar's military has killed less people than Israel has killed in Gaza. By Gove's definition, this is surely not a genocide either. Is that correct, Michael? Here's a really instructive example. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu is subject to an arrest warrant from the International Criminal Court for war crimes and crimes against humanity, has repeatedly accused Turkey of committing genocide. In 2019, Netanyahu said, Erdogan, a dictator who has imprisoned tens of thousands of his political opponents, is committing genocide against the Kurds and occupies northern Cyprus, is preaching to me, Israel and the IDF about democracy and the ethics of war. In December 2023, Netanyahu again said, Erdogan, who commits genocide against the Kurds, who holds a world record for imprisoning journalists who oppose Israel, is the last person who can preach morality to us. I mean, Netanyahu has presided over the biggest slaughter of journalists ever recorded. That alone, worth noting. Now, but this should be regarded as a confession by the Israeli state. What has Turkey done to the Kurds that is worse than what Israel has done to the Palestinians of Gaza? To be clear, I think Turkey has committed many crimes against the Kurdish people in its war on Kurdish national self-determination, but I do not believe Turkey's committed genocide against the Kurdish people. And that includes in the 1990s when the violence was on a much worse scale than today, and that was under Erdogan's predecessors. That's the determination of, for example, human rights organisations, which have accused Turkey of war crimes but not genocide. By any metric, what Israel has done to Gaza is much worse than what Turkey has done to the Kurds. So if Netanyahu believes that Turkey is committing genocide against the Kurds, then he must believe that Israel, under his leadership, has committed genocide against the Palestinian people. Name the acts that Turkey has committed against the Kurds which make it worse than what he has done to Gaza. What are they? Name them. Just one. Now, the point here is that genocides have always taken different forms. The definition of genocide, as per the 1948 Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide, is any of the following acts committed with intent to destroy, in whole or in part, a national, ethnical, racial, or religious group, such as killing members of the group, causing serious bodily or mental harm to members of the group, deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction in whole or in part, imposing measures intended to prevent births within the group, forcibly transferring children of the group to another group. Now, to turn to what Michael Gove accused Zack Palansky of, and that is of depriving the word genocide of its meaning and using the term genocide to appeal to prejudice to win an election, that is prejudice against Jews. Let's take one example here. Omar Bartov, Dean's Professor of Holocaust and Genocide Studies at Brown University. He's one of the world's preeminent scholars in genocide and Holocaust studies. He's Israeli-American and a former IDF officer. He's concluded Israel is committing genocide. His New York Times essay last year was entitled, "I'm a genocide scholar, I know it when I see it." In that piece, he said the following, "My inescapable conclusion has become that Israel is committing genocide against the Palestinian people. Having grown up in a Zionist home, lived the first half of my life in Israel, served in the IDF as a soldier and officer, and spent most of my career researching and writing on war crimes and the Holocaust, this was a painful conclusion to reach, and one that I resisted as long as I could. But I've been teaching classes on genocide for a quarter of a century. I can recognise one when I see one." Does Michael Gove believe that this world-leading genocide scholar, who has agonised over his conclusion, is depriving the word genocide of its meaning and only making the accusation to appeal to prejudice against his own people, the Jewish people? Does he? What of Amos Goldberg, Professor of Holocaust History at the Department of Jewish History and Contemporary Jewry at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem? He wrote an article for Israeli publication Local Call 2 years ago headlined, Yes, it's genocide. In that piece, he goes through different genocides, as I have done, and explains why they're different, but how in each case they are framed as being self-defense, with the perpetrator claiming that they face an existential menace. He notes that's a common theme of genocides. As he notes, in the way we normally understand such concepts, Palestinian Gaza as a geographical, political, cultural, human complex no longer exists. Genocide is the deliberate annihilation of a collective or part of it, not all of its individuals. And that's what's happening in Gaza. The result is undoubtedly genocide. The numerous declarations of extermination by senior Israeli government officials and the general exterminating tone of the public discourse, rightly pointed out by Haaretz columnist Carolina Landsman, indicate that this was also the intention. As he noted way back in April 2024, Palestinian Gaza as a society had essentially been destroyed, and it was further annihilated in the intervening nearly 2 years. We have both the end result and the genocidal intent, because there was, as he notes, an avalanche of genocidal intent from the Israeli state. In another interview conducted with Amos Goldberg for Le Monde in October 24, he said, "What is happening in Gaza is a genocide because Gaza does not exist anymore." This has itself been echoed by Donald Trump, who said a civilization has been wiped out in Gaza. Trump there was admitting genocide. He wasn't intentionally doing so, but that's the logical conclusion you draw from his comments. Once again, does Michael Gove believe that this Israeli specialist in genocide and Holocaust studies, Amos Goldberg, is ridding genocide of its meaning and using the term genocide to appeal to prejudice against his own people, the Jewish people? If so, for what end? And what of Daniel Blattman, head of the Institute for Contemporary Jewry at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem? He co-authored with Amos Goldberg an essay in Israeli newspaper Haaretz, which is specifically tailored for the objections of those like Michael Gove. It's titled, "There is no Auschwitz in Gaza, but it's still genocide," with a subheading, "This is precisely what genocide looks like." In the piece, they write together, according to the United Nations, 90% of Gaza's population have been displaced from their homes multiple times and are living in subhuman conditions that only increase mortality levels. The murder of children, starvation, destruction of infrastructure, including that of the healthcare system, destruction of most homes, including the erasure of entire neighborhoods and towns such as Jabalia and Rafah, ethnic cleansing in the Northern Strip, destruction of all of Gaza's universities and most cultural institutions and mosques, destruction of government and organizational infrastructure, mass graves, destruction of infrastructure for local food production and water distribution. All these paint a clear picture of genocide. Gaza, as a human, national collective entity, no longer exists. This is precisely what genocide looks like. Does Michael Gove think this distinguished Israeli genocide scholar is ridding genocide of its meaning and exploiting prejudice against his own people, the Jewish people? If so, why? For what end? We could go on. Shmuel Lederman, Israeli academic scholar in Holocaust studies at the University of Haifa, who in June 2024 declared the accumulative effect of what Israel has been doing in Gaza was basically genocide in terms of the harm done to the Gazans as a group. And Israeli-American Associate Professor of Holocaust and Genocide Studies, Raz Sigal, who was one of the first to raise the alarm, to identify that this is genocide in his brilliant article, A Textbook Case of Genocide. Are these Jewish Israeli scholars also ridding genocide of its meaning and exploiting prejudice against their own people, the Jewish people? If so, why? For what end? These are scholars who dedicate their whole lives to studying genocide and specifically the Holocaust. Decades and decades of scholarly work, knowing the subject inside out, living and breathing it. For Michael Gove's smear to be accurate, there must be an outbreak of anti-Semitism amongst Israeli Jewish scholars of genocide and Holocaust studies. Or what? Abject incompetence? Which is it, Michael? Now, Michael Gove might come back and say, well, actually, no, I'm not accusing them of that. I just disagree with them. But he can't backtrack from what he said. You see, he said that by accusing Israel of genocide, Zack Palansky was being wicked. He said he was depriving the word genocide of its meaning, and he was doing it for an ulterior motive, to exploit prejudice against Jewish people for political purposes. Michael Gove is not merely disagreeing, he is saying it is hateful and beyond the pale to accuse Israel of genocide, and thus he must therefore believe the same of these Jewish Israeli specialists in genocide and Holocaust studies. So he must explain why Jewish Israeli scholars specializing in genocide and Holocaust studies have arrived at such an outrageous and hateful position. And he must also explain why he, a former cabinet minister in a government only known for being a total disaster, knows more about genocide than they do. In reality, if Michael Gove was being rational, then he would have to conclude that if Jewish Israeli academic specialists in the field of Holocaust and genocide studies have concluded that Israel has and is committing genocide, then there must be a mountain of devastating evidence that Israel has committed unspeakable crimes, because scholars of that caliber and specialism could not possibly arrive at a conclusion that many of them resisted because of the implications, without there being overwhelming evidence that Israel has committed unspeakable crimes. What too of the fact that 4 in 10 Jewish Americans believe Israel has committed genocide, rising to half of all Jewish Americans under the age of 35? Does Michael Gove think they too, millions of Jewish Americans, are ridding genocide of its meaning? And do they believe that they are also exploiting prejudice against their own people? And if so, Michael, for what end? Michael Gove said it is wicked to accuse Israel of genocide. Here's what's actually wicked, Michael. It is to wipe Gaza from the face of the earth in full view of the whole world. 92% of all residential buildings damaged and destroyed. Nearly 90% of school buildings damaged or destroyed. The systematic destruction of hospitals and medical centres and the murder of over 1,700 medics. The systematic destruction of the infrastructure that sustains a modern functioning society. Libraries, archives, cultural sites, places of worship, universities. Most agriculture and farmland destroyed. Almost all livestock killed. 83% of plant life destroyed. We could go on. Conditions of life which are made unlivable. Gaza made a place that is not livable. Genocide. As for the death toll, repeated academic studies have shown that the official death toll is a drastic underestimate. And by the way, it must be said that genocides are not defined by the number of people killed. That is not what the definition of genocide tells us. Really important point to make that. But The Lancet, for example, one of the world's most prestigious medical journals, confirms that between 3 and 4% of the pre-genocide population of Gaza was killed in just over a year, a rate of killing with no precedent in any other 21st century war, let alone in that timescale. Take Syria, absolutely devastating, hideous, brutal war, one of the great horrors of our time. 2% of its population killed in the space of 13 years. So a rate of what? Half? Because they're talking there 3 to 4% in just over a year, so they're excluding months and months of further violence. Very plausible 5-6% of Gaza's pre-war population killed in both violent and also indirect killings, or more. Syria was horrible beyond words in its own right. And yet, rather than 5% or so killed in 2 years, we're talking 2% over the space of 13 years. Now, as Professor Michael Spager has put it, when discussing the profile of those killed, in terms of the number of women, children and the elderly, a notable feature of post-October the 7th Gaza is the weakness of the effect, that is, of the number of military-age men who are killed, even though military-age men, by the way, are still disproportionately killed in Gaza, even though they're not armed, because those who are regarded as just fair game, you can kill any of them that you see, as the repeated testimonies of Israeli soldiers have told us, are men in their teens, 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s, and so on. But nonetheless, there was a weakness of the effect of men of military age compared to other to actual wars. That's the point he's making. He said if Gaza was a normal war, then we would expect a much stronger overrepresentation of the youngest to pre-elderly male demographic than what we actually see in Gaza. The demographics of death resemble more closely Rwanda, 1994, and Cambodia, 1975 to 1979. than, for example, the post-2003 Iraq War or the various Balkan wars. Michael Gove is a genocide denier. He is somebody who denies a genocide for which there is overwhelming evidence and for which actual specialists in the field have arrived at the conclusion that genocide has been committed based on that evidence. He's smearing a Jewish politician for speaking up against genocide when all the evidence points in one direction, which is why I've said so many Jewish Israeli specialists in the field of genocide have arrived at the conclusion they have, even though they have in many cases agonized at length before arriving at that conclusion. And then there's the Daily Mail columnist Sarah Vine, who happens to be Michael Gove's former wife. Lovely household. She said about Zack Palansky, "I always wondered to myself how Hitler managed to persuade the German people to turn against the Jews. If you tell enough lies and spread enough poison, eventually people start believing them. Hateful, divisive little man." How dare she? How dare she? How sick is this woman? Comparing a Jewish politician to Adolf Hitler, who murdered 6 million Jews because Zack Palansky opposes genocide. Israeli cheerleaders have turned the world on its head. They've justified one of the worst crimes of our age, and their strategy in response has been to try and turn the tables in a grotesque game of deflect to portray those who oppose the genocide as the real hateful, dangerous extremists. History will record what they have done. They must not be allowed to get away with it. Please like and subscribe. Help us take on our pro-genocide media, patreon.com/Jones84. Please leave your comments, your thoughts. Share the video. I think I keep saying that. Oh, yeah. Sorry. Help us at patreon.com/Jones84. Did I say that? I don't know. I repeat myself a lot. Yeah. Share the video. I will speak to you in a bit.